Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. You may have noticed that over the last several months, I've talked very little about what I'm actually reading these days. It wouldn't be unreasonable for you to assume that means I have not been reading. However, that would be wrong, and I have a ton of books I want to talk about with you as I catch up. Today, I want to start with a set of books that are all fairly new releases, at least in the American market. I'll be back soon with some of the many backlisted and classic books I've read recently, but for today, let's stick to just a few of the 2024 books I've read recently. I read all of these on my e-reader after downloading them, some from NetGalley and some from my library's digital collections. Several of these book choices fit into what Jamie Cade calls Memoir May. I stumbled across her video a day or two ago, and when I saw her thumbnail, the first thing I thought was, how did I not know this was going on? Well, it turns out that Memoir May isn't yet a booktube event, but I hope Jamie will turn it into one next year. And many of these choices also fit into the wonderful theme month hosted by Marilyn Maya Mendoza and Kim at Middle of the Book March, Mental Health May. Thank you both so much for putting this booktube event together. Finally, I think you could fit several of them into the great Misery May, hosted by Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot and Gemma of Gem of Books, since all of these books, almost, are about finding ways to come to terms with sadness and pain. On to the books. First, let's talk about the book We Loved It All by Lydia Millet. In most part at least, is made up of vignettes about her connections to the natural world. But most of the book is also something larger than a memoir. She's addressing the environmental crisis and also how humans are responding to the changes in the natural world that we're seeing around us. She points out something that I think a lot of us have known all our lives, that we often act as if there is a huge separation between human beings and the entire rest of the world, including animals, our closest relatives, and often our companions. This is such an important conversation, and I love many parts of this book, especially when Millet talks with great empathy and connection with everything around her. I'm far less persuaded by her embrace of a non-sectarian idea of prayer. As she says, her writing, quote, takes the form of prayer. I'm a completely secular person, and I don't personally use the language of prayer even as a metaphor for connection or justice or compassion. But I can imagine that deeply religious people might also be frustrated by her use of prayer to mean what I think is just a call to other people to be committed to the natural world, not to religious prayer. I thought the author would smooth out that issue more, given the power of some of her previous fiction. I was also a bit ambivalent about one aspect of her narration. Millet often uses the second person, we, or our, which in a way invites readers to recognize how we are part of her world, or at least that she sees us as part of that world. But there are times when I don't necessarily believe what we believe. Every time that happened, it was jarring, making me feel far more separated from Millet than I would have if she had talked about relatively universal human thinking, but completely embraced first-person narration. It would have been easier for me to engage with her ideas, to really think about them and consider them, if I had not been constantly on the defensive about what sometimes I felt like was her assumption that I agreed with her already. On to the next book. In Grief is for People, Sloane Crosley writes about the death by suicide of her friend Russell and her experiences going through grieving afterwards. Crosley paints Russell as an electric personality, and her account of their connection is really moving. She is stunned and shocked after he dies, and she's also heartbroken. I've read a lot of books about grieving lately, and very few are as direct and frank about what grieving can feel like as Crosley is. We watch her as she tries to find various ways to confront her sadness and to stop being angry. Sometimes she turns to dry humor. And certainly this book has moments that are quite funny, but the humor often felt almost like denial to me. Still, she's eventually able to accept Russell's death through her embrace of honesty and introspection and compassion for both herself and Russell. She chooses to honor his humanity in prose that sometimes feels almost corny, but at the same time hits pretty deep. To be honest, when I finished this book, I had extraordinarily complex feelings about it. She was going through something similar to what I went through after my spouse David died. And yet at the same time, it was something so utterly different, with a whole set of issues that I didn't have to face. A few days ago, I put the audio of this book on hold in my local library, and I think I might read it again in that different format. Perhaps on this reread of it, I'll have an easier time focusing on her own approach rather than constantly comparing it to my experiences and emotions. The next book I want to discuss is Lissa Soep's Other People's Words. Although I think many people might respond better to Sloane Crosley's memoir than to this one, I found this book subtle and surprisingly moving. On the surface, it too is about death and grieving, although there's something else going on too. What sets up this book is the death of two of the author's close friends, Johnny, who died suddenly in a swimming accident, and Christine, who died slowly from an illness that profoundly reshaped her cognition. Soep, who had been close to not only these two people, but also their wives, writes from a perspective that is a bit more controlled or more academic almost. That word academic often implies that it's emotionally removed or distanced, and that isn't true here. At least for me, it wasn't. Instead, it's a step backwards that allows her to see a bigger picture even while she's expressing her pain. And that bigger picture helps her come to terms with what happened to her friends, both the friends who died and to their now widowed spouses. What she does to get to this bigger angle is to talk about my very favorite literary theorist and ethicist, Mikhail Bakhtin. One of his most influential books is The Dialogic Imagination, which I first read my senior year of college. I was doing some studying with one of my English major friends who was struggling through a whole stack of dense books for his class on literary criticism. When I finished my book about medieval social history or the history of medicine or whatever I was reading for class, I picked something out of his stack. Immediately, I loved Bakhtin's idea of heteroglossia. That is, the concept that all language contains within it a multiplicity of perspectives or viewpoints. And the reason it's true is because language is fundamentally created and expressed in conversation, in dialogue with each other. In other words, instead of emphasizing text alone, we should also be thinking about context. You can imagine that this was the kind of literary theory that would fit perfectly for us historians out there who are always most concerned with context. Because I was pretty much unaware of literary theory when I was 21 years old, I very quickly started thinking of Bakhtin's ideas in very personal and real-life kinds of ways. Whenever I talked to my academic friends about how I had essentially incorporated his theories into my non-academic life of friendships, they all looked at me as if I were nuts. But here in this book, the author is doing exactly that. Soep's major point is that language, conversations, and even specific words, the language that we use and the language that the people around us use, contains echoes from people we know or people we have known in the past, and especially from people we've loved. Okay, this next book is a little different. Trondheim by the Irish writer Cormac James is a novel, but it has echoes of the kind of psychological investigation we might expect to find in memoirs about the same kind of subject matter. Here, Lil and Alba find out that their 20-year-old son, Pierre, has been hospitalized and put into an induced coma following a heart attack that completely stopped his heart for an unknown period of time. The two women rush from their home in the south of France to Norway, where their son was studying, at least until his hospitalization. They do not know if he will live or die, and even if he lives, they don't know how much brain damage he will have. That is, they don't know if he will be himself as they always knew him. Everything is hanging in suspension. Lil and Alba have been married for a long time, and when we meet them, they are remarkably different people, and their relationship is on unsteady and uncertain grounds. But facing this crisis of their son's medical emergency exacerbates the difficulties they've long faced. They respond in very different ways. Lil, cold and aggressive sometimes, seeks a connection in one of Norway's lesbian bars. There she meets a young woman who needs a mentor and a friend, not a lover. Alba, more emotional and more religious, finds connections inside the hospital with the families of other ICU patients. I read this novel several weeks ago, and it has stuck with me far more than I initially thought it would. At first, I was struck by the fact that I could not imagine why Lil and Alba had gotten married in the first place, much less how their marriage could have lasted for more than 2 decades. I also struggled to understand what Lil was looking for in her adventures outside the hospital. At some point, though, I got it. Not in the particular so much as in the abstract. She was trying to establish something in her life that was not Alba, but also crucially anything that was not the ICU, not the uncertainty and not the unresponsive body that the plot revolves around. That unresponsive body of their son hanging in the balance is a metaphor, I think, for the gaping hole in their relationship. It isn't clear if it will survive this emergency at all. But even if it does, it isn't clear what shape the relationship will take. Just as it isn't clear that even if their son awakens, he will be the son he was before. In other words, there are 2 crises here, and I think this book will stick with me for a long time. One more book. The new book by the great actor Judi Dench, called Shakespeare, the Man Who Pays the Rent, is absolutely delightful. If you're looking for rigorous scholarship about the life or the plays of the bard, this is not the book for you. But it is a tremendous romp through Dench's lifetime of experience playing an incredibly wide variety of roles in stage performances, as well as film adaptations of Shakespeare's work. The book is not so much a written text as an account of a series of conversations she had with the director Brendan O'Hay. Together, they work through the plays, giving brief synopses and pointing to major themes, but also sharing many of the key lines from the plays and discussing what Shakespeare might have meant, as well as how actors over time might have twisted those lines slightly. Sometimes these conversations between Dench and O'Hay focus on the particular choices individual directors made and how they affected viewers' interpretations of Shakespeare's texts, as well as how they might have affected the actors and other crew members working on particular performances. All of this is done in a very light and often very funny style. Dench and O'Hay have a wonderful teasing rapport. And at the same time, there are some deeply insightful moments in every chapter about Shakespeare, about performances of his work, and also about acting in general. If you're a Shakespeare fan, or if you're a Judi Dench fan, or if you're just interested in the link between any text and any adaptation or performance, I encourage you to pick this book up. And Rather than reading the text, you might decide to listen to the audio. I had the opportunity to look at both. The audio is, not surprisingly, recorded by Dent herself, whose personality is completely compelling. There are moments where the conversation part starts to feel a little too canned, perhaps because it's so edited, but her answers never seem canned. I should have said this earlier, but this year's theme for Mental Health May is self-care. Kim and Marilyn made it clear that we can define self-care as we please. The books I talked about early in this video focus on people who are trying to find ways to take care of themselves while they're going through difficult times. The death of friends by suicide or serious illness, a medical emergency, combined with a relationship very much on the rocks, grieving. And this last book, the one by Judi Dench, is a different kind of self-care. It's the kind of book that will lighten our own spirits. It will remind us that not just humor, but the deep embrace of memories, including sweet memories of people who are no longer in our lives, is one of the ways we can heal. Well, that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for joining me here today. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.